since the year 2000, we've had Millennium Development Goals, which and education for all. Education for all touches education from birth to death, but the Millennium Development Goals chose universal primary education as a particular focus and gender equality in school as a focus. The consequence of that was government spent all the money they were prepared to spend in development on schooling, primary schools, and forgot that if you want children to learn, you need to teach their mums as well. And adult education, adult learning in most of the world's had a really tough time. The challenge we've got in the next period, it seems to me absolutely central issue for all of us who work with adults as learners. It's, on the one hand, adult education is at the margins of the education budget. It's a small bit of spending when you compare it with the university systems or large TAFE colleges or the schooling system. But at the same time, as well as being a thing in itself worth loving and celebrating, it's also a catalyst. It helps other things happen. You don't get a change in the behaviour around HIV/AIDS without people learning what it's got to do with them. You don't get, even if you put all the facilities in, clean water and sanitation without people working through what kinds of changes it involves for their own lives. There are budgets for adult and community education in all kinds of government departments here, but how do you connect them up? And that's the challenge, isn't it? How do you get people to work across silos? Because adult learning can help with all those things, but that isn't something we've managed together to make very visible to decision makers. Raymond Williams, the first place I worked in adult education, it was in a Quaker meeting house in Brighton on the south coast of Britain. And before I was there, Raymond Williams used to teach there. He's an inspiring writer. He invented cultural studies, really. He wrote a wonderful book called Culture and Society while he was teaching adults. But he wrote a lot about adult education too. And he said at times of change, when things are challenging around, adults turn to learning for three reasons: to understand what's going on, to make adjustments, to adapt in the light of it, and to shape change. And it does seem to me that the heart of what we do is about the third of those. Of course, understanding matters, and of course, making sense of what you might do in the light of changes around you also matter. But to give people a sense of control, of dynamism, of agency is the core business. And as you go about the work with adult education, I've always found that a core question is who isn't there and what can be done about it. You do a wonderful programme for the people who turn up week after week. It's effortless to recruit them. They have fun. It's a very positive experience in itself. And all's hunky-dory unless you notice who doesn't come. And then you have to ask, well, what is it that would open the door? How do you go about changing the framework for your work? And when I first went to the Friends Centre, the brilliant Australian adult educator, Mike Newman, had just produced a little pamphlet called Adult Education and Community Action, which I read like a Bible. And we mapped, we went and talked to butchers, we talked to solicitors, we talked to firemen. What kind of learning do you do, or does the people in your community do? And then we looked at our own curriculum in the light of it. And, you know, it was remarkably tame and dull, wasn't it? And a bit later, when I worked in London, I looked at our prospectus for Battersea, and I looked at one from 1923. And boxing, you know, was at the same time on the same evening, and dressmaking the same time on the same afternoon. I don't think it was the same group of students. And I'm not sure whether the tutor hadn't been there since the 20s, but if you thought of what had happened on the radio or on television over 50, 60 years, you wouldn't expect the programmes to look exactly the same. Now, either we've cottoned on brilliantly to a core business early and whoopee, let's carry on doing it, or else our own blinkers preventing us from responding to things that stimulate other people. And really, my experience at the French Centre was very much to do with that. I was employed by the students. I'd know it was an association that set up after the war, really, to try and make the world a better place. It had more grand aspirations than the United Nations, really. More modest achievements, of course. And I lived in the building, and so I realised that the first fundamental thing for being an adult educator is cleaning the cups away and setting out the chairs, resetting out the chairs, and so on. But while I was there, the local authority, well, two things. One, I was lucky enough to help start the campaign to teach adults to read and write in Britain. We'd been doing it, I should think, 10 minutes. I tried, you can imagine, leafy Quaker meeting house. We thought we'd invite unemployed people in for a cup of tea, and the cultural barriers to wanting to come in were pretty high. 6 people came over a fortnight of heavy leafleting at the job centre, and all of them actually had a challenge with reading and writing. So we began work on literacy with them. 10 minutes later, a national campaign was announced in Britain, and so I was a national expert, and I've been a national expert ever since, you know. So I'm deeply sceptical about expertise, as you might understand. It's a bit problematic because my wife is the head of a professional body, and I spend all my time saying, well, amateurism's got something to be said for it as well, you know. She quite often wants to shoot me, which is, of course, why I'm abroad. Anyway, it's literacy work. Of course, because there wasn't a national campaign, we assumed, I think perfectly understandably, that Freire in Latin America was right, and that literacy is about reading the world, and incidentally, about reading words. Read the world, and you're back with the Raymond Williams business of shaping it, that help people start from the things that make them cross, the things they want to change, and you find no problem with people turning up. I remember first time I came to Australia, which was, I don't know, 25, 26 years ago, there was an issue in the Murray-Darling River Basin with blue-green algae just emerging, still there. Well, the kind of energy of community gatherings, of the learning around what can we do about it, how can we square the interests of farmers and fishermen and people living in the local community, was an illustration, really, of what we thought was the way you went about literacy work. That led to local MP deciding that we're probably politically biased. He said, these people have got vulnerable minds, he said. And well, we had a bloke who, first person I taught to read, actually, who said he'd run his own business. He'd been a tunneler in making the underground, the tube line for the Victoria line. And the man next to him had had an accident. His very, very successful person. And he thought, well, if that happened to me, what would happen with my family? And so I better go and learn to read and write. So when the MP went on the telly and said, suppress, depress, oppress, picking up one of our worksheets, isn't this all insidious politics? He said, well, he said, I'm not reading Bleeding Andy Pandy, that's a racing certainty. He said, I've run my own business, I've brought up my family, I voted, he said, for your party up to now, he said to the MP, and saw it off. So then eventually there were government inquiries, and they decided not only were the materials not biased, but they were the best ones there were, and they published them as a core of some of our work. So the place was full of really creative people who worked there. And then the local authority decided to close down any funding on adult education. And I was speaking to someone from the department, well, somebody senior in the department, about is there any value in funding adult and community education? Can't people pay all the price for themselves? And it's the same story. In this case, they said they didn't want to pay for tap dancing on the rates, the leader of the council said. And we'd done all the normal things of writing and going quietly and lobbying and being to County Hall. And I was a student in the 60s, and I remember the energy people had in sit-ins when there'd be squabbles. You know, people ostensibly went in there because they had a grievance, but actually they stayed because it was a whale of a time and a great party. And I thought there's something in this. We ought to be celebrating fighting for adult education by doing it. So we decided we'd run an all-day and all-night teach-in for a week, starting at 9 o'clock on Monday morning and finishing just in time for the Quakers to have the meeting house back at the weekend. And I taught an all-night history of rock music, which 88 people came to and started squabbling about Led Zeppelin at 4 in the morning and never got to the end. And there was an all-night film course on women in detective fiction. The astronomers were in the garden all night, every night of the week. And of course, there were things at 6 in the morning and all the way through the day, a Messiah singing. People could pay anything they wanted to come. People taught for nothing. And we got the thing sponsored, a penny an hour. So as long as somebody was learning for the whole of the 134 hours we were functioning. And the television and radio came monotonously, because nothing much happens in the middle of the night. And the national news happened. And by the end of the week, the leader of the council went on the radio and said he'd been badly advised and reversed the policy because there was so much noise about it. Well, really, in a way, that's where Adult Learners Week came from an idea that there's an enormous energy to be got out of doing normal things in a slightly displaced way. So what was clear during the week, half the people who came had never been to a class before. So it reached people. Partly through the news stuff, but also because it's like as if you ran a course in the middle of the road, people'd notice it in a way that, you know, on a quiet Wednesday evening in the rain, they might not in a public building. People went to classes, then they went and cleaned the toilets, or they went, not straight away after, they went and helped in the canteen and so on. And actually after the week, when we'd won, as it were, anything we did for months was full, however rubbish it was. It was absolutely stacked with people turning up and wanting to do things. We found out of it an ability to resource and fund a centre for homeless people in Brighton, growing out of a course we ran on how squatting wasn't working. After that, I moved quickly, mysteriously, to London after the teaching. And I suppose the kind of things I wanted to illustrate there were how you can take a perfectly conventional idea and just tweak it a little bit. So working with African Caribbean groups in the Wandsworth area, they're saying, the thing is, lots of us run small micro businesses and have got trades and so on. We want to be able to let other people know that black people in Wandsworth are not all unemployed drug addicts, you know. So they produce, we have in Britain, I expect you've got them here, yellow pages, which are kind of adverts for goods and services. And they produce Wandsworth black pages. And of course it meant... That's what I mean, very simple. You know, now that's an adult education activity with a very concrete outcome for the people who were involved in it. And at the same time, they were closing down Battersea Power Station, which is a huge, iconic and very beautiful building on the Thames. And, you know, if you look in the inside pages of the financial papers, in our case, the Financial Times, there are people fantasizing about how to organize the future all the time. And we thought it was a core part of our work to stimulate popular planning, to engage people in thinking what they might do with this building too. And I think we're going to do something not unlike that in a little while. Dream up projects and do them. I mean, it's still an empty building, I'm afraid. We didn't win, but a spin-off from it, it's like we ran a big conference about what we should do, and people said, never mind that. People working with childcare in this borough are getting wildly different rates of pay. There are people who are looking after kids at home getting tuppence halfpenny, and other people working in the public services, in the health service or whatever, being extremely well paid. Can't we do something? Looking after children is common experience. Can't we make it a more reasonably and equitably organised activity? So they ran, again, a spin-off conference. Again, useless. Nobody who's well paid wants to give up being well paid to bring their salaries down. That's the problem with the world, you know, enough to eat, but look at the gaps between the affluent. Oh, you have that in Western Australia, of course, especially if you're lucky enough to work in the extractive industries, don't you? There are challenges. But as a spin-off from this conference, so that's 2 events in, I noticed that a large number of single parents living around Clapham Junction, an inner city area about 3 miles from the centre of London. Lots of single parents, women, living in high-rise towers, going bonkers, actually, with small children. And in order to go shopping, you have to pay for a babysitter, and off you go. There's a new supermarket development happening in Clapham Junction. And the women who ran the conference for us went to see the developers and said, if you build a creche, all these people who live locally will come shopping at your centre. If they have to hire a babysitter, they'll go uptown. And so they did. And now all around London, you have supermarkets that far out, 3-4 miles out, which have childcare facilities. Very practical outcome, quality of life. Nobody looking at the creche at Clapham Junction would recognise that that's the product of an adult education activity. When people talk to me about measurement of the outcomes of adult education, nobody predicted that that's where the Battersea Power Station initiative was going to lead to. But as long as you're thinking reflectively and purposeful, and you keep an open mind, you can find that you stumble onto things that really make a difference to people. It's not scientific, it's not really grown up, but it does work, I think. In that area, I suppose family learning has been the arena of work that's impressed me most in most parts of the world as making a terrific difference. I was reading something this morning about a project in Uganda in family literacy, saying, well, what were the outcomes of having parents and children learning together, but especially mothers and children learning together. And the evaluation study said 15% fewer girls get beaten by their fathers as a result of taking part in learning. 67 days average girls allowed to go to school increased as a result of a family learning program. Very practical, real outcomes. And, you know, there's a lovely African proverb, which is that if you teach a woman to read and write, you've taught a village. It is clear. There are 240 million people who've been to school for 4 years or more who don't read or write a word. And it's almost all in contexts where their parents haven't been engaged in the activity. Family learning is, I mean, at the core of your work, but also, I think, absolutely a vital component of our programmes of activity. And here is a link the organisation I used to run made with the Preschool Learning Alliance in Britain, and Woman Third In used to run the Preschool Learning Alliance, working with a group of single mums in Thurrock in Essex, and celebrating just finishing a major programme of development in that area. Come 1992, and I'm working in the national body for adult education in Britain, and I went in to see an official in the Department of Education who said to me, there's no such thing as adult education. He said, what? I said, he said, no, it's all further education, and you'll stop using the word from now on, please. And I said, what? And sure enough, there's a white paper published, which was, once again, intending to abolish this area of work. I'm trying to suggest to you that our work involves a bit of guerrilla warfare. I think changing the metaphor is the next main point that I'm really wanting to make. As part of this debate, people stood up in Parliament and said, we don't want to pay for flower arranging on the taxes. So we went and found a florist in Brixton, in the heart of Black London. This is not that long after riots in Britain, it centred on Brixton. And he'd been a merchant banker. And he'd gone to evening classes as his industrial retraining, and he then employed half the class to work in the shop with him. We got his photograph taken and got the thing written up in the national newspaper. And within 3 weeks in Parliament, people were making speeches saying, of course, we know flower arranging can lead to floristry. So I thought there's something in this of how you make the case. And we engaged the English equivalent of the Country Women's Association is National Federation of Women's Institutes. 9,000 branches. All of them wrote letters, often to their husbands. Within 6 weeks, the government changed its policy. It said, well, frankly, the vast majority of them didn't know that they were deciding adult education didn't exist and shouldn't exist anymore. And actually, the government of the day recognised that when they went home in the evening, they were living in communities that were nurtured by something that was minimally expensive and rich in the culture of people's lives. So changing the metaphor does seem to me quite an important part of the work. Recognising that our work's invisible, that these things came along on a regular basis in part because we didn't make enough positive fuss about what we were doing, we decided to run an Adult Learners Week with a number of real goals behind it. One, to celebrate how different learners are. They're extraordinarily varied in the purposes they learn for and the things they get out of learning. And the more you ask who isn't there and do something about it, the more different they are. So the first thing was to, and this was culturally very challenging in Britain at the time, to have competitions to find outstanding adult learners so that we could put them on the telly. And second thing was to persuade the telly that this was really good television, because, you know, instead of thinking, isn't adult learning, isn't adult education boring, something that happens quietly somewhere, not for the likes of me, suddenly they were talking about people whose lives had been transformed in the most extraordinary ways by their learning, and they're great human interest stories. So we got adverts on the national television year after year telling stories about adult learners. We put a reception in Parliament so they wouldn't forget and they'd meet people. We ensured that we produced research every year that would have just enough troublesome stuff in it to make them think about adult learning, if for only for 1 week. And we've carried on doing it, and it's now a big national institution. And I think, as you said, it was adopted by the UN. And I once came to Australia when the federal government had a bit of money and didn't quite know what to do with it. And somebody asked me to go and tell them about Adult Learners Week, and then you got one too, really. So, and it's a bit like that. There's a wonderful one in Russia where people, they take the Trans-Siberian Railway and they get out at every stop along the way and do an adult education event in the station area, and also take a boat down the Volga River and do the same. Every time it stops, you have a little instant festival. In Benin, in Africa, there's a lorry which goes to every village in the country in the 3 weeks leading up to International Literacy Day to fire people up for the things that they're going to do. What I've been saying is something about Harbans Bhola, who's an Indian, very distinguished educator, makes a distinction between adult education as registers and classes and all the paraphernalia of signing people up and charging fees and so on. And he calls that adult education as structure. But he also says adult education is culture. And within the adult education culture, adults educate other adults by beating drums for attention, singing folk songs and shouting messages over loudspeakers, putting posters on the wall and organising exhibits, organising political and religious functions on street corners or in city parks, and by spreading the message over radio and television. He's suggesting, as I've been doing, that making a fuss is also part of the business. And the truth is, posh frock days always enjoyable. If you give, and we produced really nice certificates for everybody who was nominated for an Adult Learners Week award, and it's heartbreakingly powerful stories of what works for people. I thought I'd sum up how you make the case, since it does seem to me that making the provision is not enough in our work, and I think you can't insist on using your own language. You've got to talk in the language of other people. If people like to count the numbers, you have to talk in the language of numbers. If they want to talk about vocationalism, you have to show the learning journeys that people take between community-based activity. The second goal, I think, is the politics of generosity. When in doubt, give in. It's extremely powerful to say okay and to, for now, not in the long run, but for the short run, you don't have to win. So my job for the last 20 years has been arguing with the government, getting up in the morning and saying and adults, and as if that was a brand new idea. And you'd say, we're going to fight you on this issue. And they'd say, it'd be very inconvenient on Tuesday next week because we've got this or this. I say, okay, well, we'll start on Thursday. So absolutely no reason why we should be unreasonable, but we're still going to fight you. Identify, support, and celebrate your allies. You can compromise in the short run, but in the long run, you've got to be firm about what you want. And that was the second lot. This is the first. I did in the wrong order. Banging drums, I just talked about. Mobilising learners. Learners are their best advocate. I said about who isn't there. Quite important to know more than the people you're discussing or arguing with, to have researched your own territory, to ask your own learners, what is it that motivates them? What is it that helps them progress? What will make a difference to you and your community? I've been trying to illustrate in a sort of half-hearted way new forms of learning. If you start from a question, you don't always end up with a register and a class. You can end up with different forms of activity. Then I thought about sleeping with a policeman. There was sleeping policemen are names of the bumps in the road in England, you know, which sort of slow down the traffic. And so this is a really stupid way of saying a key part of the work is working alongside the people you don't automatically agree with. But it's a more vivid phrase than saying something long-winded and boring like that. Making yourself indispensable to people and no surprises. Making campaigning for adult learning, it's not like a political party. Surprise is a great thing in politics. You catch someone out, you get a short-term advantage. The issue in our work is to win the argument for the long run. So always tell people what it is you have in mind to do. Then I thought I'd move on and say something about the work we did at NIACE with adults with learning difficulties and the work they did, a whole group of people in a conference just like this, had somebody going on and on and on speaking, and then they got to work and they created a charter of what we expect and want from places we go to learn. So the right to speak up, we're adults with a voice, we want to be heard. The right to choose to go to classes, we should have a say in what we learn. You know, people get bussed by off to their day centre and you will do art and you will do, I don't know, literacy. One poor student said to me, I don't need to do literacy anymore. I've done it for 14 years. I know the next worksheet that's coming along. You understand the needs of the tutor and the needs of the student aren't automatically in harmony all the time. The right to have support, someone you can rely on to help. The right to have the chance to make friends, to mix with the crowd a little more and make new friends. The right to have fun learning, I thought that should be a human right, along with, you know, the right to free association and so on. The more you enjoy it, the more you learn. And the right to good access, that was one. And then 6 more. The right not to be bullied. The right to be treated as adults with respect. The right to have clear information that we can understand, the right to have good teaching, the right to be able to do a course to get a job, and the right to learn in a nice place. Now, you know, that was the product of about 3 months' hard work by a group of people out of a single afternoon like this one. And actually, I think it's a charter that, never mind adults with learning difficulties who use it very proudly, but it's not a bad charter for anybody, really, in the end. And it's distinctively, tonally different than a bureaucrat would write. So here's Fred Moore. He was 107 when this picture was taken, and he was the oldest learner in England. We, as part of Adult Learners Week, we went out and had a competition to find the oldest learner in Britain, and we had a party at the Department for Education. The idea was the ministers. Steal ideas from other people. It's a good wheeze. And he hosted the party. It had the oldest learner in Britain, in each of the regions, and the most adventurous study being done by someone over 100 in each region. So the most curious and the oldest. And there were 20 of them at the party. And we now have every year a Fred Moore Prize for the most imaginative work done with older adults. I'm sorry, the two of you who were with me this morning and carry on and tell the same story. I left the party where Fred was to go to something else in Adult Learners Week. I got in a taxi and told the dad, he was really bubbling. He was a wonderful man. He studied art and French in his retirement home in New Milton in Hampshire. And he, which is where you come from nearly, isn't it? He told the taxi driver about it. He said, here, he said, doesn't he know yet that he's not going to be Picasso? And after that, long pause, and he said, still, he's twice as old as me and much more gumption. I think I ought to do something too. And you know, I went to an event in Tasmania 6 years ago, and I was sitting in a taxi and a chap talking on the radio, exactly the same stuff about an older person learning, and the taxi driver said the same thing. He said, that's really inspiring. Why don't I do something? So I think there's a real business with taxi drivers if you're... in fact, interestingly, in an area of the northwest of England, taxi drivers are often new migrants to areas. And in Blackburn, the local adult education organiser leapt in a taxi and said, I want you to drive me to the very end of your route and back again. And because I want to talk to you. I don't really care where we go. You drive around, I want to talk to you. And with this chap, by the end, he'd bullied him into thinking what a good idea it would be if all the taxi drivers came and had a meeting about what they'd like to learn. And of course, by the finish, he said, no, nobody'd ever come. And now the Taxi Drivers Association of Learners in Blackburn is one of the features of that bit of the northwest of England. I'm suggesting you all go bonkers. You all do something that's outside of your comfort zone, and then you'll be authoritative adult educators. This is Justine, who has a learning difficulty, a profound one, who wrote her own book, which we published, and Learner's Voice is something else I'm very keen to say. These women are in Serbia, in what was Yugoslavia, and they're not affluent. And they've got a computer on their lap, as you can see. And the inspiring thing about new technologies is, as a result of the learning they did, they can talk to their great-grandchildren in Australia. Do you see? And it's as an image for me of what does ICT really mean in our work. It's a spectacular illustration, and it comes from Serbia's Adult Learners Week, actually. Only Connect. I thought it was worth just giving you a little bit of more serious information that we did major studies in Britain of all the people born in the same week in 1957. They get interviewed every 7 years, so you can find out a lot about social change. And because it's everybody who was born in that week, it's really robust evidence. And we added questions about adult education to them. And most of the answers here come from that survey. But the fact that adult education prolongs active citizenship is quite important, really. It delays the impact of Alzheimer's. That is, you don't not get Alzheimer's, but because you're learning, your neural networks are more active, you go around it. And you keep going much longer without it making an impact. And then, frankly, you die faster. And actually, that's, you know, in that context, I think that's a good thing, that you aren't, you know, hopelessly dependent on on your near ones and dear ones for longer than you need to be. So learning is quite a good thing, this is arguing. You're 13% more likely to give up smoking if you're a learner. 34%, absolutely astonishing figures about people who took up learning and hadn't done it before. 34% increase in racial tolerance compared with the population who weren't engaged in any kind of learning. As we get older, they tell us we become more politically cynical. But you become politically cynical at a slower rate if you're a learner. Now, I think for politicians, that's a good wheeze for investment. And there's also studies to show that once you sort of in your early 20s and the first flush of youth has arrived and perhaps gone, things get more miserable until you're 42. And after 42, they get better for the rest of your life. Every year is better than the last one. And this is the one good news, because lots of things don't work quite as well as you get on, but there's lots of statistical evidence about well-being and happiness that tell us this is true. The truth is learners hit that curve just a bit quicker than other people do. So learning's very good for you, and it's cheap. And what's extraordinary is these impacts happen whatever you're studying, whether it's nuclear physics or knitting, or anything else, and whatever your social class. And mostly you can predict how much people are likely to join in, certainly in a country like Britain, which has still really quite strong social class predictors. The people who didn't do well at school, the people who are at the bottom of the employment heap, the people with the poorest housing, mostly they don't join in learning. But if they do, they get all these benefits just the same as everybody else, like that. So learning is good for you. So, and then, well, we found all this out, and then another civil servant told me that adult learning was an evidence-free zone. Of course, what he meant was none of the evidence convinces them. I went to argue with the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Minister of Finance in Britain, 2 years ago when they were making lots of cuts. And, you know, we produced all this evidence, and it's really rigorous. And his officials said, nah, they said, you can only show association. You can't show causality. From this stuff. You can't say it's because you did adult learning. You could say people who improve their racial tolerance by 34% might then are more likely to do adult learning. You could say it was the other way around. And we said, yeah, fair enough. We said, but isn't that true of qualifications and productivity too? That there's a strong association, but you can't prove the causality on it. But the one fits your prejudices, and the other's brand new to you, so why don't you think about it? And they didn't make any cuts. So that was one of my finer moments. But that was because I had a very powerful minister who shared our prejudices, used to be the governor of an adult education centre next to me. And I've no doubt that the Treasury are just biding their time, and the minute the minister changes, we'll be back shafted. So there we are. Now then, I'm about to sit down. But I thought I'd finish telling you that there are 4 key skills, in my view, for adult educators. Of course, there's all the stuff about managing registers and coming in on time and that. But the real ones are dreaming. I've been trying to talk about thinking outside your box. Stealing, which is not normally something you encourage people to do. But ideas are different than other things. That is, I remember sitting at school next to Gerald Pooley, who asked me in the middle of an exam how to do a particular maths sum. And I told him. And we both got into trouble because, you know, you mustn't look at the other person's piece of paper. Learning's private, it's yours. And of course, it's not like that at all. If you steal my ideas, I've lost nothing. And you change them anyway, and I can steal them back again afterwards. So I use the word stealing rather than borrowing or sharing because I wanted to confront something about the privatization of knowledge and of... So dancing is the American revolutionary Emma Goldman said, if I can't dance, I don't want to join your revolution. And that sense that life should be fun. and showing off, because if you don't show off, nobody will steal your ideas. And I think that's enough showing off, so I'll sit down.